With that said, it does beg the question, what's the story with MS and resistance training? So, do people adapt to resistance training? Is there a reason resistance training is important? And the answer is yes to both. So firstly, this study is basically I just put it here to give some context as to why we might want to consider resistance training. So I'll read this here. The mean muscle fiber cross-sectional area of all fibers, as well as cross-sectional area of type 1, 2, and 2A fibers were smaller, and muscle strength of the quadriceps was lower in MS patients. So decrease in fiber cross-sectional area, decreased muscle strength of the quadriceps in those with MS. Additionally, body composition was comparable between groups, so between groups of healthy controls and people with MS. However, compared to healthy controls, the biopsied leg tended to have a higher fat percentage and lower lean mass in MS patients. So what we're seeing is that people who have MS basically have less muscle, less strength, and more body fat at a given level of body composition or body weight, you could say. And that's just reflected over here in this diagram. So what you'll see from this muscle biopsy is that in the bottom example here is from a healthy control. The top example here is from someone with MS. Obviously, it's not necessarily a reliable comparison or a one-to-one comparison because they're different individuals. But what you see here is that in green, there's a higher density in this individual of the fast twitch muscle fibers, so the muscle fibers that are responsible for producing higher forces and those that are most responsive in terms of hypertrophy or muscle growth. So what that tells you is that we do have this reduction in fibers that are producing the most force and that grow to the greatest size in people with MS, and that's also reflected in other research demonstrating lower levels of stem cells for these types of muscle fibers. That can potentially go on to explain the deficits that we see in MS. In addition to that, the question then obviously is, okay, that's fine. These guys, Wenz et al., they demonstrated the atrophy and the downsides at the level of the muscle and in terms of body composition. But what about intervention? You know, that's the important question. Does this change when we intervene? And the same research group went on to do this study here. So high intensity exercise and multiple sclerosis, effects on muscle contractile characteristics and exercise capacity, a randomized control trial. So they basically did, they basically looked at people with MS. They looked at them in a sedentary case. So those doing just sedentary, doing nothing. Those who did high intensity interval training as the cardio along with resistance training, and those who did high intensity continuous training along with their resistance training. And what you see is that in those who did, I'll basically just pop up the little adaptations here. So just to summarize that study and to summarize the next study, because I got a systematic review and meta-analysis which adds more detail basically, so giving you more information about the overall body of evidence on some of these other factors. But basically what we see when people with MS do resistance training as well as other exercise interventions, so in this case interval training or continuous training, what we see is an increase in fiber cross-sectional area, so an increase in the size of muscle fibers. It's fiber type specific, so we see an increase, particularly those muscle fibers that have been atrophied the most in terms of the faster twitch muscle fibers. So we do see the regrowth or the regeneration of those losses, you could say. That's probably not the best way of putting it. Not the regrowth, but the reversal. There you go. That's the word I was looking for. The reversal of the atrophy that we see. In addition, the fiber type specific consideration there is also important, because the high intensity resistance training, or the high intensity interval training, or the high intensity continuous training, the high intensity continuous training versus high intensity interval training. The difference there is that there are fiber type specific adaptations. So if you're doing longer continuous training, you see more adaptations at the level of the slower twitch muscle fibers versus the faster twitch muscle fibers in the high intensity interval training. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to really take action on that. Your resistance training is going to be taking care of the force production and the hypertrophy outcomes, and then your cardiovascular training or cardiorespiratory training could be either or both interval and continuous training. We generally recommend both in someone with MS, particularly if they're more advanced. I'd probably start with just some continuous training before I touch on the intervals. Increases in muscle strength, increases in endurance capacity, increases in lean mass, decreases in fat mass, increases in quality of life, and increases in fatigue. Sorry, that should say decreases in fatigue. That's completely my bad. Decreases in fatigue. Really important. That's not what I want to get across. There's a decrease in fatigue, not an increase in fatigue. Okay, and you obviously see that reflected here in this graph. So this is percentage change compared to baseline. And this is knee extension, this is knee flexion, this is knee extension, this is knee flexion at 45, 45, 90, and 90 degrees. And what you can see is that in those who do the high intensity interval training plus resistance training, they had the greatest increases in knee extension strength as well as knee flexion strength. Whereas those who did the continuous training, they had very significant increases in strength, much above the sedentary group. Sedentary group basically had more or less no change. So the interval training did seem to be superior from the perspective of increasing strength, and that was particularly the case when we look at the strongest leg versus the weakest leg. So the interval training does seem to be quite a positive intervention in that context. But yeah, this is actually a good study because it did look at a resistance training protocol that we would, see in the real world. So it wasn't just like light therabands. It was actually doing things like sets of 10 on like lat pull downs and leg press or leg extensions, etc. Okay, so yeah, the question that we wanted to answer in this slide is, firstly, what happens with muscle in MS? So all the bad stuff basically, and can we reverse that? Obviously not fully. We're not going to get the same level of gains as someone without MS, at least not long term. But can we reverse the direction of those changes? Yes, we can. Okay, yes, we can. People can gain muscle. People can gain strength. People can improve their endurance, their quality of life, and decrease their fatigue.